For 10 epoch-making days, Casablanca became the solar plexus.
January 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill meet in Casablanca to discuss the strategy for ending the Second World War. A major outcome of the secret conference is a commitment to a cross-channel invasion. A full-scale invasion of the continent, as early as practicable in 1944. The countdown to D-Day had begun. But the Americans had two major problems. At this stage of the war, no principle existed in U.S. Army doctrine for assaulting a heavily fortified and defensively prepared coastline. The second problem was that the British had already claimed all of the suitable beaches for their own training. The only place left available to the Americans was a stretch of coastline on the Atlantic coast. An area which the British themselves had discounted as too stormy and unsuitable for amphibious training. The Americans were allocated an area of the North Devon coast, centered on the seaside resort of Woolacombe. Prior to the arrival of the Americans, it was used by the British as the home for the Southern Command Weapons Training School. The task of heading up the assault center was given to an experienced engineer, Colonel Paul Thompson. When Thompson and his staff first arrived in Woolacombe, they couldn't believe just how fortuitous they were. The surf, tides, firmness of sand on those North Devon beaches bore an uncanny similarity to the Normandy beaches over which the Americans would launch their invasion. The Woolacombe Bay Hotel became the headquarters of the Assault Training Center. The hotel was used for administration, lectures, exercise briefings and occasional social events. Most of the officers were billeted in the local boarding houses, whereas the enlisted men would usually be placed in more austere accommodation. As was typical of the American experience of wartime Britain, the GIs, owing to their boundless generosity, were enthusiastically welcomed by the local children. The GIs were also welcomed by the older population. Many GIs had local sweethearts, and some of those sweethearts became brides. The enlisted men also enjoyed access to the social facilities provided by the Red Cross. Back then it was known as the Bungalow Cafe, today it's the Red Barn. The visiting GIs, signing the register, left their mark. In 1943 no principle existed within the U.S. Army for assaulting a heavily fortified enemy coastline, and the only published advice in a U.S. Army field manual was, fortified areas are avoided in the initial assault and taken from the rear. Assaulting the enemy-held coastline of Normandy required not only the creation of a new and unique doctrine, but also the training of thousands of troops in those principles. And time was short. The Assault Training Center's doctrine was the culmination of a month-long conference. Military experts were seconded from every Allied service, to thrash out a workable method to neutralize the German defenses. The doctrine called for a 3-week training schedule, to train troops to break through enemy beach defenses, and take the fight inland in order to establish a beachhead. As Colonel Thompson put it, the fight for the first 1,000 yards. The doctrine centered around the formation of 30-man assault sections. It was decided on 30 men, as this was the maximum load for the landing craft, the LCVPs, at that time. you can get up close to this LCVP on Utah Beach. These 30-man assault sections were a self-contained team of specialists, collectively capable of destroying an enemy pillbox or strongpoint. Within the assault section, riflemen, machine guns, and mortars were to provide suppressive fire on the enemy. Bazookas and flamethrowers would be fired at the pillboxes. Bangor torpedoes would be used to blow open gaps in the barbed wire, and through these gaps the demolition teams would rush the pillboxes and neutralize them with explosive charges. The long stretch of Woolacombe Sands was dedicated to practicing large-scale amphibious assaults. These exercises took place at the end of the 3-week training course, and were a chance for the troops to put all their training into practice. The area was also used for communications training and demonstrations. Here men from the 1st Infantry Division practice using their combat radios. The area around the Saunton golf course was given up to provide the assault teams with realistic and valuable training. Here, the men are practicing how to use cargo nets to embark on landing craft. Men were also trained in the use of flamethrowers against realistic concrete mock-ups of German bunkers. It was here that the men would receive training on the use of bazookas against fixed fortifications at the Bazooka Wall, and assaulting realistic replicas of German bunkers. Braunton Burrows is a stretch of coast dominated by large areas of dunes. It's very reminiscent of the dunes on Utah Beach. Just as it was an important part of the assault training center back then, today the area is still used for military training. To facilitate the flow of military traffic, the American engineers constructed roads, as can be seen here. The engineers also built 6 concrete replicas of landing craft tank, known as LCTs, and also 2 LCMs. These structures matched the dimensions of the LCTs exactly, and enabled the men to practice the loading and unloading of vehicles and equipment. These concrete mock-ups gave the Americans essential practice in unloading their vital equipment quickly. On D-Day, They would do this under machine gun and artillery fire from German fortified positions. In the 6 months that the Assault Training Center was active, 14,000 men of the assault divisions, who landed on the D-Day beaches, had trained at Woolacombe. A quarter of those men would end up as casualties on D-Day, including Colonel Thompson, who was himself critically wounded on Omaha Beach. In 1992, a memorial was erected in Woolacombe. This memorial is dedicated to those thousands of American soldiers, whose preparation on the sands of Woolacombe and Saunton, in the months preceding D-Day, carried them to glorious victory on the sands of Normandy. The memorial was dedicated by the former commander of the Assault Training Center, Brigadier General Paul Thompson.